Victoria's laughter echoed through the executive hall as she straightened Daniel's tie, but the sound would haunt her within minutes. His promotion party had attracted every major player in the industry, celebrating not just his advancement through the ranks of the struggling Thompson Corporation, but the mysterious acquisition that had saved it from bankruptcy, yet none of them knew the savior's identity. Daniel's mother held court at the head table, regaling guests with stories of her son's brilliance while casually mentioning how she'd helped remove a distraction from his life. But the old woman's smile masked a cruel satisfaction. That distraction had been her daughter-in-law, the pregnant woman Daniel had abandoned 3 months ago, when her feet had swollen so badly she could barely stand. But his response had been to tell her walking would help with the swelling before driving off with his mistress instead. 5 miles in 90-degree heat while 8 months pregnant should have broken any woman, but she'd made it to the clinic, received her treatment, and made 3 phone calls that would cost the Thompson family everything they'd built. His mother had watched that walk from an air-conditioned window, laughing at each stumbling step and calling neighbors to mock the dramatic little gold digger. But none of those neighbors knew the gold digger's net worth exceeded the entire neighborhood's combined value by several $billion. The company Daniel was celebrating had been on the market for 6 months, desperate for any buyer willing to keep the Thompson name. But the anonymous corporation that purchased it had one non-negotiable condition: complete operational control immediately. When she walked through those executive doors, her pregnancy visible beneath an Armani suit, the entire promotion party went silent. But the real chaos erupted when she announced the company's new policies. They dropped to their knees, Daniel, his mistress, his mother, and every Thompson family member on the payroll, as she systematically kicked each one out with security escorts and legal termination papers. But her face showed no satisfaction, only cold efficiency. The secret trillionaire they'd tortured stood calmly dismantling 70 years of family legacy in less than 20 minutes. But the question ricocheting through every witness's mind cut deeper than any revenge. What kind of person hides billions to watch how people treat the powerless? And the terrifying follow-up, if this was her response to one cruel afternoon, what had she been planning during the hundreds of cruel days before it? What this story teaches. This narrative will educate you on the profound consequences of cruelty, the strategic value of patience, and how those who suffer publicly may be planning privately. It delivers powerful lessons about respecting everyone's humanity, regardless of their apparent position, understanding that some tests are passed over years, not moments, and recognizing that ultimate justice often comes from unexpected sources. As a viewer, you will benefit from seeing how methodical planning defeats casual cruelty, when learning that some people document everything, and understanding that treating people well isn't just moral, it's protection against the unknown power they might actually wield. The crystal chandeliers of Thompson Corporation's executive floor cast prismatic light across 200 faces, but none of them belonged to Daniel Morrison's wife. Victoria Chen adjusted the platinum bracelet Daniel had given her last month, the same month he'd stopped wearing his wedding ring, and surveyed her handiwork with satisfaction. The promotion party she'd orchestrated down to the smallest detail represented everything she'd envisioned. Her lover celebrated as the company's new vice president, his inconvenient wife conspicuously absent, and most importantly, his mother's public blessing of their relationship disguised as casual conversation. But the disguise fooled nobody who mattered. The chocolate fountain she'd insisted on stood next to ice sculptures shaped like the Thompson family crest. But the real centerpiece was Daniel himself, resplendent in the Tom Ford suit she'd selected, accepting congratulations from executives who'd watched the company nearly collapse 6 months ago. Daniel's mother, Patricia Thompson Morrison, commanded the head table like the Connecticut aristocrat she'd been born as, but her bloodline meant less than it once had now that the family company bore someone else's name on the corporate filings. Her champagne glass, crystal, because she'd insisted nothing else would do, caught the light as she gestured expansively to the cluster of board members surrounding her. "My son has always had vision," she announced, her voice carrying that particular blend of pride and ownership that wealthy mothers perfect over decades. But her audience knew the real story. The Thompson Corporation had been hemorrhaging money for 3 years, taking increasingly desperate investors just to make payroll. But Patricia had refused to acknowledge reality until the foreclosure notices arrived. The mysterious corporate buyout 6 weeks ago had saved them from public humiliation. But the terms had been unusual: complete ownership transfer, immediate operational authority, and absolute anonymity for the purchasing entity. The new owners clearly recognized talent, Patricia continued, her words slightly slurred from her fourth glass of champagne. But nobody corrected her. They've kept the Thompson name, maintained our legacy, and most importantly, they've given my son the position he deserves. She paused, her smile sharpening into something cruel. And I'm just grateful Daniel finally has space to focus on his career without certain distractions. The word hung in the air like poisoned perfume, but the executives around her understood perfectly. His wife, the woman Patricia had nicknamed the anchor in private conversations, had been noticeably absent from company events for months now. Victoria moved through the crowd with practiced grace, her red dress turning heads despite, or perhaps because of, the wedding ring still adorning several of those heads, but she'd stopped caring about social conventions around the same time Daniel had. She reached his side just as the CEO began tapping his champagne glass for attention, but her hand on Daniel's arm conveyed ownership more clearly than any speech could. "You ready for this?" she whispered, her breath warm against his ear. But Daniel's attention had already shifted to the executive entrance. The doors at the far end of the hall opened with mechanical precision, but the woman who entered didn't match the caterer's uniforms or the guest's formal attire. She wore an Armani power suit in charcoal gray, tailored to accommodate her visible pregnancy. But the cut and fabric screamed money in a way that made Victoria's designer dress suddenly feel like a costume. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, but her face carried no expression as she moved toward the podium, with the kind of confidence that comes from having nothing left to prove. Security flanked her, but they weren't protective. They were operational, carrying tablets and document folders that suggested official business rather than celebration. "Ladies and gentlemen," the CEO began, his voice uncertain as he noticed the woman's approach, but she reached the microphone before he could finish his introduction. He stepped aside, confusion evident in his posture, but the woman's calm smile suggested this interruption had been planned with precision. Victoria's hand tightened on Daniel's arm, but he'd gone completely rigid, his champagne glass frozen halfway to his lips. At the head table, Patricia's laughter died mid-note, but her face hadn't yet registered recognition, just irritation at the disruption. "Good evening," the woman said, her voice carrying through the sound system with crystal clarity, but there was no warmth in the greeting. "Thank you all for gathering tonight. I believe it's time we properly introduced ourselves." She gestured to the security team, who began distributing folders to specific individuals throughout the room, but their route followed a pattern. Every Thompson family member on the company payroll received one. "My name is Elena Rodriguez Morrison," she continued, her hand resting on her pregnant belly, but the surname finally triggered recognition. Daniel's champagne glass shattered against the marble floor, but Elena's smile never wavered. "And I believe we have some business to discuss." The executive hall had contained 200 conversations 30 seconds ago, but now it held only one sound: Daniel's ragged breathing as he stared at his wife. Elena stood at the podium with the kind of stillness that comes from absolute control, but the security team around her moved with military efficiency, placing leather folders in front of each Thompson family member with deliberate precision. Patricia's hands shook as she opened hers, but the legal letterhead at the top made her champagne-flushed face go pale in seconds. Victoria hadn't received a folder, but her confusion was transforming into something sharper as she watched Daniel's expression crumble. "For those who don't know me," Elena continued, her voice never rising above conversational volume, but the microphone carried every syllable to the room's farthest corners. "I've been Daniel Morrison's wife for 2 years, 3 months, and 14 days. She paused, letting the specificity of that timeline sink in, but her eyes remained fixed on the 3 people at the head table. "I've also been the silent majority shareholder of Rodriguez International Holdings for 8 years, but that's a detail my husband never thought to investigate." The leather folders in front of the Thompsons suddenly made sense, but Elena wasn't finished. 6 weeks ago, through a subsidiary corporation, I purchased the Thompson Corporation in its entirety. All assets, all properties, all contracts, and most importantly, all employment agreements. Daniel found his voice, but it came out strangled. That's impossible. The buyer was Titan Consolidated. We vetted them. He stopped. But understanding was dawning with the slowness of a nightmare. The shell company? You've been planning this. Planning implies future tense, Elena corrected, her hand moving to the tablet one of her security team offered, but her eyes never left Daniel's face. This is execution, which is present tense. And yes, Titan Consolidated is one of 17 shell corporations under the Rodriguez Holdings umbrella. But my lawyers can explain the corporate structure if you're interested. She swiped the tablet screen, but the gesture was casual, almost bored. What matters right now is that as of 9 a.m. this morning, I became the sole operational authority of this company, which means every employee, including every Thompson family member, serves at my discretion. Patricia lurched to her feet, but her aristocratic composure had shattered completely. This is insane! You can't just... Daniel, tell her she can't do this! Her voice scaled upward into panic, but her son remained frozen, his eyes fixed on Elena's pregnant silhouette. You're nobody. You're just some girl he married. You don't have the education, the background, the money, Elena finished, but her smile contained no humor. You're right, Patricia. I don't have money. I have wealth, which is different. Money is what you inherit and slowly lose through 3 generations of mismanagement. But wealth is what you build by understanding markets, leveraging assets, and making strategic investments. She advanced from behind the podium, but her movement was unhurried, almost gentle. For instance, I understood that a 70-year-old manufacturing company with an outdated business model, but valuable real estate holdings, and an internationally recognized name was significantly undervalued at $12 million, but only if you could remove the family members whose incompetence was destroying it. Victoria finally found her voice, but it emerged as a hiss directed at Daniel. You married a billionaire? You've been crying poor, making me pay for dinners, telling me we had to wait until your financial situation improved. And your wife is a... She stopped, but her hand had already connected with Daniel's face in a slap that echoed through the silent hall. You lying pathetic? I'd be careful about finishing that sentence, Elena interrupted, her voice still calm, but 2 security personnel had moved closer to Victoria. Daniel didn't know about my wealth because I made certain he couldn't know. But that was intentional. I wanted to see who he really was when he thought I had nothing to offer except devotion. She turned her attention back to Patricia, but her expression had hardened into something glacial. I wanted to see how his family would treat someone they considered beneath them, but I got my answer 3 months ago. The room's temperature seemed to drop, but Elena continued without pause. June 14th, 2:47 p.m., 93 degrees outside, but you were comfortable in your air-conditioned living room, weren't you, Patricia? The older woman's face had gone from pale to gray, but recognition was flooding her features now. You watched from your window as I asked my husband, your son, for a ride to the clinic because my feet had swollen so badly I couldn't fit into shoes, but his response was instructive. Daniel's voice came out as a whisper, but the microphone caught it anyway. Elena, please, I can explain. I didn't understand how serious... You told me walking would help with the swelling, Elena said, but each word was precisely enunciated, like a surgeon making careful incisions. You told me I was being dramatic. You told me Victoria needed you more because she had a spa appointment she'd scheduled weeks in advance. But then you got in your BMW, the one I'd purchased for you as an anniversary gift, though you never asked where I got the money for it, and you drove away. She turned to address the crowd, but her voice remained steady. 5 miles, Summer, that's the distance from the Morrison family home to the women's clinic on Riverside Drive. But I walked it in 93-degree heat while 8 months pregnant with a condition called preeclampsia that could have killed both me and my daughter. Patricia made a sound like a wounded animal, but Elena's attention snapped back to her with laser focus. You watched me stumble down that driveway, Patricia. You stood on your porch with a glass of iced tea and you laughed. But I remember your exact words because I recorded them. She tapped her tablet, but the audio that filled the room made several executives flinch. Patricia's voice, tinny through phone speakers but unmistakable. "Martha, you should see this dramatic little gold digger limping down the street like she's dying. I told Daniel she was just trying to trap him with that baby, but he's finally seeing through her act." The recording continued for 30 seconds, but Elena stopped it before it finished. "I made 3 phone calls from the clinic that day," she said quietly, but the silence in the room made her whispers sound like thunder. "The first was to my lawyer, the second was to my accountant, but the third was to a private investigator, because I needed documentation of everything, every cruelty, every affair, every lie." She looked at Daniel, but her expression held no anger, only a cold finality that was somehow worse. "You failed a test you didn't know you were taking, but the grade is final." Victoria's voice cut through the tension, sharp with desperation. "What do you want? Money? We can pay you back for whatever Daniel took. We can—" "I don't want money," Elena interrupted, but her smile returned, cold and precise. "I want justice, which looks different, but let me show you." Elena's security team moved with synchronized precision, but their actions felt rehearsed, like a play performed after months of preparation. The leather folders that had seemed ominous minutes ago now revealed their true purpose as each Thompson family member opened them to find termination letters, severance calculations, and legal disclaimers that had clearly been drafted by attorneys who charged 4 figures per hour. Daniel's folder was thickest, but that made sense given his position. Former position, the letter clarified in its opening paragraph. Patricia's hands trembled so violently that pages scattered across the table, but nobody moved to help her collect them. "The terminations are effective immediately," Elena explained, her voice maintaining that same professional calm that made the cruelty somehow worse. But she'd clearly learned from the best corporate executioners. "Severance packages are calculated according to your original employment contracts, not the inflated executive compensation packages you awarded yourselves last year, but you'll find everything legally compliant." She gestured to the security personnel, who began positioning themselves behind each Thompson family member, but their presence was more symbolic than threatening. "You have 15 minutes to collect personal items from your offices under escort, but company property, including phones, laptops, and access cards, must be surrendered before you leave the building." Daniel finally found the strength to stand, but his legs nearly buckled as rage and disbelief warred across his features. "You can't do this. I have a contract. I have rights. One will sue you for everything you—" He stopped, but the irony of threatening to sue a billionaire for her money seemed to register even through his panic. "This is revenge. This is just vindictive, petty revenge because I made one mistake. But you're destroying people's livelihoods over endangering your pregnant wife's life?" Elena interrupted, but her eyebrow arched with something that might have been curiosity if it weren't so cold. "Over 2 years of systematic emotional abuse documented by 3 private investigators. Over 14 separate affairs. Yes, Victoria, you're number 14, not his great love story. That were conducted with company resources and company time. But that's actually the least interesting part of your file." She tapped her tablet, but the projection screen behind her flickered to life with spreadsheets that made Daniel's face go white. "You've been embezzling from the company for 18 months, Daniel. Small amounts, nothing that would trigger audits, but it adds up to approximately $340,000, which you spent primarily on your mistresses. But some went to gambling debts you've been hiding from everyone, including Victoria." Victoria's head snapped toward Daniel, but her expression had transformed from desperate to murderous in seconds. "You told me you were divorced. You told me your wife had left you and taken everything. You told me we were building a future together, but you're just a lying, broke, pathetic—" She lunged at him, but security intercepted her smoothly, still holding her back as she screamed obscenities that made several executives turn away in embarrassment. Patricia's voice cut through the chaos, but it had lost all its aristocratic refinement and emerged as pure venom. "You think you're so clever, don't you? You think you've won something here, but you're still just a pregnant nobody who trapped my son with a baby, and everyone in this room knows it." She was standing now, but her designer dress and inherited jewelry looked ridiculous on someone whose face had contorted with such naked hatred. You'll never be one of us. You'll never have the breeding, the class, the 70-year-old company name that I now own completely? Elena finished, but her smile was genuine this time, if terrifying. You're right, Patricia. I'll never be one of you. But that was always the point. I didn't want to be a Thompson. I wanted to own the Thompsons, which mission accomplished. She nodded to her security team, but they were already moving, guiding Patricia toward the exit despite her protests. Your severance includes the house, by the way, the one where you watched me nearly die. I'm deeding it to you outright, but I've had the property taxes reassessed to reflect its actual market value. You'll owe approximately $45,000 annually, which should be interesting on your fixed income without company dividends. But I'm sure you'll figure something out. The realization hit Patricia like a physical blow, but Elena had already moved on, addressing the broader room with the efficiency of someone checking items off a list. For everyone else in this room who isn't named Thompson, your jobs are secure, your benefits are unchanged, and your contracts are honored, but we'll be making some operational changes over the coming months. She paused, letting relief wash over the non-family employees, but her next words demonstrated why she'd become a billionaire before 30. This company has been dying slowly for 3 years because incompetent leadership prioritized family legacy over profit and innovation. But that ends today. We're pivoting to automated manufacturing, cutting our physical footprint by 40%, and negotiating 3 international contracts that should triple revenue within 18 months. The executives who'd been watching the Thompson family drama with horrified fascination suddenly looked at Elena with a different kind of respect, but she wasn't finished. There's a reason I kept the Thompson name despite buying the company. It has brand recognition, customer loyalty, and 70 years of goodwill built by people who actually cared about quality, but that was 3 generations ago. Your founders would be ashamed of what you let their legacy become, and fixing it starts with removing the people who broke it. Daniel was being escorted toward the exit now, but he twisted back with enough force to break free for a moment, his voice cracking with desperation. Elena, please, think about our daughter. Think about what you're doing to her father. I am thinking about our daughter, Elena said, but her hand moved to her belly in a gesture that was protective, almost fierce. I'm thinking about what kind of man I want her to see as her father, and the answer is definitely not you. But I'm also thinking about what kind of woman I want her to become. She moved closer to him, but her voice dropped low enough that only Daniel could hear, though the microphone still caught fragments. I want her to know that money isn't everything, but having it means you never have to tolerate cruelty from people who think you're powerless. I want her to understand that being underestimated is sometimes the greatest advantage you can have. But most importantly, I want her to know that walking 5 miles in unbearable pain while carrying her made me strong enough to walk into this room and destroy the people who caused that pain. Daniel's face crumbled, but Elena stepped back before he could respond, nodding to security. They escorted him out with more force this time, but Victoria was screaming after him about money he owed her, and Patricia was threatening lawsuits she couldn't afford to file. The executive hall that had been celebrating Daniel Morrison's promotion 15 minutes ago was now watching the complete destruction of the Thompson family empire. But Elena stood at the center of it all with the calm of someone who'd planned every detail. The doors closed behind the last Thompson, but Elena remained at the podium, her hands steady on the tablet that contained 2 years of documented abuse, financial records, and strategic planning. Now, she said to the remaining executives, her voice shifting into pure business mode, but there was satisfaction underneath. Let's discuss Q4 projections and the automation timeline. We have a company to rebuild. The executive hall had emptied of guests an hour ago, but Elena remained at the head table, surrounded by file boxes, legal documents, and the remnants of a promotion party that had transformed into an execution. Her security team had departed after confirming the building was secure, but her lead attorney, a woman named Margaret Chen, who charged $800 per hour and was worth every penny, sat across from her, reviewing the final termination paperwork. The chocolate fountain had been shut off, but the ice sculptures had melted into abstract puddles that maintenance would clean in the morning. Elena's feet ached beneath the table, But she'd learned 3 months ago that physical pain was temporary while strategic victories lasted lifetimes. The embezzlement charges against Daniel are solid, Margaret said. Her reading glasses perched on her nose as she flipped through bank statements, but her expression suggested professional admiration rather than sympathy. We have documentation of 47 separate transactions, all small enough to avoid automatic flagging, but the pattern is unmistakable once you know to look. She glanced up at Elena, but her next question was careful. Are you sure you want to file criminal charges? The civil case gives you everything you need for the divorce, but prosecution means publicity, media attention, and my daughter deserves to know the truth, Elena finished, but her hand moved to her belly where the baby was kicking with increasing frequency. Not the sanitized version where daddy made mistakes, but the real truth where he stole from his family's company to fund affairs while his pregnant wife walked 5 miles in heat that should have killed her, because that's the man he actually is. She accepted the glass of water Margaret offered, but her throat was tight with emotions she'd been suppressing for 3 months. I don't want revenge anymore, Margaret. I want documentation. I want a paper trail that my daughter can access when she's old enough to ask questions about why her father isn't in her life. But I also want every future employer to know exactly who Daniel Morrison is when they Google his name. Margaret nodded, but her expression had softened in the way it only did when they discussed Elena's daughter rather than legal strategy. The recording of Patricia is particularly damaging. Elder abuse charges based on her treatment of you while you were in a vulnerable medical state could result in no criminal charges for Patricia, Elena interrupted, but her voice was firm. The house with the reassessed property taxes is punishment enough because she'll either have to sell the family home her grandfather built or watch her retirement savings drain away paying to keep it. That's a slower, more poetic form of consequences, but it also gives her time to reflect on what her cruelty cost her. She paused, but the next admission came harder. I don't want to be cruel, Margaret. I want to be just, which sometimes looks similar from the outside, but feels completely different from the inside. The attorney studied her client for a long moment, but her expression was unreadable. You could have destroyed them more thoroughly. Well, you have documentation of Patricia's tax evasion from 2019, evidence of Daniel's gambling addiction that could trigger intervention from social services once the baby is born, and Victoria's previous history of affairs with married executives that could end her career in this industry. But you're choosing strategic mercy. She closed the file folder, but her hands rested on top of it. That's either wisdom or weakness, Elena. I can never tell which with you. It's exhaustion, Elena admitted, but the truth of it settled over her like a physical weight. I've spent 2 years documenting every cruelty, every lie, every moment of humiliation, because I needed evidence for this exact night. I've played the role of the helpless wife so convincingly that Daniel actually believed I was dependent on him. But maintaining that performance while building a corporate acquisition strategy and hiding my real identity has been... She trailed off, but her eyes glistened with tears she refused to let fall. I'm tired, Margaret. I'm 8 months pregnant. I destroyed my husband's family tonight. And tomorrow morning I have a company to rebuild because 200 people are counting on me to actually know what I'm doing. But part of me just wants to disappear to one of my properties in Switzerland and never see any of these people again. Margaret reached across the table, but her touch on Elena's hand was gentle rather than professional. You could do that. You have 17 properties across 9 countries. Enough money that your great-grandchildren will never work a day in their lives, and also in legal documentation that gives you sole custody before the baby's even born. But you won't disappear because that's not who you are. She squeezed Elena's hand, but her voice carried certainty. You stayed in an abusive marriage for 2 years to gather evidence. You walked 5 miles while suffering from a potentially fatal medical condition because you needed that moment documented. You orchestrated tonight's revelation with the precision of a military operation, but you did it at a promotion party specifically because you wanted maximum witnesses to your husband's humiliation. Your point? Elena asked, but she already knew the answer. My point is that you're not the type of person who walks away from battles, even when you've already won them, Margaret said, but she was smiling now. You bought this company because you want to fix it, not just to punish the Thompsons. You're filing criminal charges against Daniel because you believe in accountability, not just revenge, but you're showing mercy to Patricia because you understand the difference between justice and cruelty. She released Elena's hand, but her gaze held steady. You're not a victim playing dress up as a powerful woman, Elena. You're a powerful woman who temporarily played the role of victim to expose the people around you, which is completely different. And tomorrow morning, every employee in this building will know the difference. Elena absorbed those words in silence, but the baby kicked hard enough to make her wince. She's active tonight, she murmured, her hand moving to the spot where tiny feet pressed against her ribs. But the sensation grounded her in a way nothing else could. I wonder what she'll think about all this when she's old enough to understand, because that recording will exist forever. The videos of tonight will circulate online no matter how many takedown notices we file. She'll grow up knowing her mother destroyed her father's family at a corporate party, but will she understand why? You'll make sure she understands, Margaret said with quiet confidence, but she was already packing her briefcase with the efficiency of someone who'd worked past midnight countless times. You'll show her the medical records from that day. You'll let her read the private investigator's reports. You'll explain that you gave her father every opportunity to be the man he pretended to be, but he chose cruelty every single time. She paused at the door, but her final words carried the weight of prophecy. And when she asks if you regret marrying him, you'll tell her the truth, that marrying Daniel Morrison was the most expensive education you ever purchased. But the lessons you learned were worth every penny of pain, because they taught you exactly who you are when everyone thinks you're nothing. The door closed behind Margaret, but Elena remained at the table as the building settled into nighttime silence. The promotion party decorations looked absurd in the harsh fluorescent lights. Maintenance had switched on. Wilted flowers, melted ice, and abandoned champagne glasses that had once celebrated a future that would never happen. She pulled out her phone, but the messages waiting made her smile despite everything. Her board members congratulating her on a flawless execution, her mother asking if she was okay, and 3 missed calls from journalists who'd somehow already heard about tonight's events. But there was one message she hadn't expected, sent from an unknown number 20 minutes ago. You won tonight, but you lost something too. Call me when you figure out what. No name, no context, but Elena recognized the number as belonging to the private investigator she'd fired 2 weeks ago after receiving his final report. The one that had contained information she'd specifically told him not to pursue. Her hand hovered over the call button, but she stopped herself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, running a company she'd purchased for revenge, raising a daughter alone, and living with the consequences of strategic cruelty that had felt justified in the moment but might feel different in the years to come, because that was the thing about revenge nobody warned you about. It satisfied perfectly in the moment of execution, but left questions that haunted you forever after. Elena stood slowly, her pregnant body protesting after hours in heels, but she took one last look at the executive hall where she'd destroyed the Thompson family legacy in less than 30 minutes. The woman who'd walked 5 miles in unbearable heat 3 months ago had been genuinely powerless in that moment. But the woman standing here now controlled hundreds of millions in assets and employed 200 people whose livelihoods depended on her decisions. The transformation was complete, but as she turned off the lights and headed toward the elevator, one question followed her into the darkness. Had she become powerful by exposing Daniel's cruelty? Or had she simply revealed the cruelty that power had been hiding inside her all along? The elevator doors closed on that question, but Elena knew the answer would take a lifetime to fully understand. Justice and revenge looked identical from most angles, but the difference lived in the quiet moments afterward, in how you treated the next person who needed mercy, in whether you learned compassion from suffering or simply learned new ways to inflict it. She placed both hands on her belly as the baby kicked again, but this time her smile was genuine, untainted by strategy or performance. Your father failed a test he didn't know he was taking, she whispered to her daughter, but the words were for herself too. Let's make sure we pass the ones we do know about. The elevator descended toward the parking garage where her driver waited, carrying her away from the promotion party that had ended a dynasty and begun something else entirely. Something that looked like victory through the champagne-stained lens of tonight, but might look completely different in the morning light. Because that was the thing about revenge dressed as justice. It always delivered exactly what you asked for, but never quite what you needed. The morning sun filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows of Elena's corner office. But the view had changed since that night 18 months ago. The Thompson Corporation logo still adorned the building's exterior. She'd kept that promise, but the interior had been gutted and rebuilt with the kind of efficiency that came from unlimited capital and zero sentimentality. The chocolate fountain and crystal chandeliers were gone, but in their place stood collaborative workspaces, automated manufacturing displays, and a company cafeteria that actually fed employees decent food instead of vending machine despair. Elena sat at her desk reviewing quarterly reports, but her attention kept drifting to the playpen in the corner, where 15-month-old Sophia Rodriguez Morrison was attempting to stack blocks with the same determined focus her mother brought to corporate acquisitions. The baby had her father's dark hair, but her mother's eyes, brown and watchful, missing nothing. And lately she'd started walking with a stubbornness that suggested she'd inherited more than just genetics. The nanny Elena employed was excellent, but 3 days a week Elena brought Sophia to the office anyway, because she wanted her daughter to grow up understanding that power and motherhood weren't mutually exclusive, though balancing them required more energy than building a billion-dollar empire ever had. The international contracts you negotiated brought in $47 million last quarter, Margaret said from the doorway. But she was smiling at Sophia rather than discussing legal matters. The board wants to discuss expansion into the European market, but they're terrified of suggesting it because last time someone questioned your strategy, you spent 20 minutes explaining exactly why they were wrong using only their own data. She entered without invitation. Their relationship had evolved past formality months ago, but she carried a folder that looked ominous. You have a visitor request. Daniel wants to see Sophia. The quarterly report Elena had been reading suddenly required all her attention, but her hands had gone completely still. His parental rights were terminated 9 months ago. He signed the papers himself in exchange for avoiding criminal prosecution. But he's not allowed contact until Sophia is 18 unless she initiates it. Her voice was steady, but Sophia had stopped playing, her toddler instincts sensing her mother's tension. What does he actually want, Margaret? Forgiveness, probably, the attorney said, but she set the folder down unopened. Or closure. Or to convince himself he's not the villain in this story, because apparently seeing his daughter's face on your Instagram, yes, I told you those posts were a mistake, reminded him that consequences are permanent. She paused, but her expression had softened into something almost sympathetic. He's broke, Elena. The gambling addiction you documented wasn't just a phase. He's living in a studio apartment, working data entry for $18 an hour. And his mother sold the family house 6 months ago to move into senior housing she can actually afford. But none of that is your problem. No, Elena agreed, but she stood and moved to the playpen, lifting Sophia into her arms with practiced ease. It's not my problem, but it's her history, and someday she'll ask me if I kept her father from her or if he stayed away on his own. She pressed her face into Sophia's dark curls, but the baby squirmed with typical toddler impatience. Tell him no. Tell him when Sophia is 18. If she wants to meet him, I'll provide his contact information and pay for therapy to process whatever comes from that meeting. But until then, the man who made me walk 5 miles while carrying her doesn't get access to the result of that walk. Margaret nodded, but she didn't move toward the door. There's something else in the file. Victoria Chen, the mistress, got engaged last month to a pharmaceutical executive, but she's been contacting business journalists, trying to sell an interview about the real story of what happened that night. She finally opened the folder, but her expression suggested she'd rather not. She's claiming you planned everything from the beginning, that you deliberately trapped Daniel in a marriage to destroy his family, and that the promotion party humiliation was premeditated emotional abuse, because apparently she's workshopping a victim narrative that positions her as the one who suffered most. Elena laughed, but the sound held no humor. She's not entirely wrong. I did plan the promotion party revelation for maximum impact, and I did document everything systematically. But the trap she's describing requires me to have known Daniel would be cruel before I married him. She returned to her desk with Sophia on her hip, but she was already formulating responses. The truth is messier than either version, villain or victim. I married a man I thought I loved, discovered who he actually was when he thought I had no power, and then used resources he didn't know I had to ensure he faced consequences. But whether that makes me righteous or ruthless depends on which parts of the story you emphasize. The courts emphasized the medical endangerment and embezzlement, Margaret reminded her, but she was watching Elena carefully. You're legally and morally in the clear, but you're also still angry, which concerns me. I'm not angry, Elena said, but even she didn't believe it. I'm unfinished. I destroyed the Thompson family, rebuilt their company into something profitable, and I'm raising Sophia in a world where she'll never depend on anyone for basic survival, but there's something incomplete about it all. She set Sophia down in the playpen with new toys, but her hands lingered on the rail. That private investigator who sent me the cryptic message the night of the party, the one who said I'd won but lost something, I finally called him back last month. Margaret straightened, but her lawyer instincts had clearly activated. What did he find that you told him not to pursue? Daniel's father, Elena said quietly, but the words carried weight that filled the office. The man who supposedly died in a car accident when Daniel was 12. He's alive, living in Oregon under a different name. And he left because Patricia was exactly as cruel to him as she was to me. But he didn't have billions to fight back. She pulled a photograph from her desk drawer. A man in his 60s with Daniel's features, but kinder eyes. He's been following the company news. He saw what I did to his ex-wife and son, but his message to the investigator was interesting. Tell Elena Rodriguez that revenge doesn't fix the broken parts. It just proves you survived them. The office went silent except for Sophia's babbling as she played, but Margaret's expression had shifted into something complicated. Part concern, part recognition. Are you going to meet him? I already did, Elena admitted, but she was watching her daughter rather than her attorney. Last week I flew to Portland and we had coffee. He told me about the 20 years he spent rebuilding his life after escaping Patricia's control, about the therapy it took to forgive himself for abandoning Daniel to her influence, and about how watching the promotion party video made him realize his son had become exactly what his mother had shaped him into. But that realization came too late to change anything. She paused, but tears were threatening for the first time in months. He asked me if destroying the Thompson family made me feel whole again, and I told him the truth. It made me feel powerful, but power and wholeness are completely different things, and I'm still figuring out which one I actually needed. Margaret moved around the desk, but her embrace was surprising. The attorney who charged $800 per hour rarely showed physical affection. Firm, but the woman underneath that professional armor understood trauma in ways she rarely discussed. What did he say to that? He said that Sophia would teach me the difference, Elena murmured into Margaret's shoulder, but she was crying now, 18 months of strategic coldness finally cracking. He said children don't care about your revenge plots or your quarterly earnings. They care about whether you're present when they fall, whether you laugh at their jokes, and whether you teach them that love means staying even when walking away would be easier. But that's exactly what I'm terrified of, that I'm so good at strategic cruelty now that I won't know how to be genuinely kind to my own daughter. You brought her to work 3 days a week when you could afford the world's best nanny full-time, Margaret said gently, but she was pulling back to look Elena in the eyes. You kept the Thompson company name to honor the employees who built it, not the family who broke it. You showed mercy to Patricia when you could have destroyed her completely, and you're refusing to let Daniel use Sophia as a path to redemption he hasn't earned. Because all of those choices prioritize other people's well-being over your own satisfaction. She wiped Elena's tears with unexpected tenderness, but her voice was firm. You're not a villain, Elena. You're a woman who survived cruelty by becoming strategic enough to ensure it never happened again, which is different. And Sophia will understand that difference when she's old enough to hear the full story. Elena nodded, but she moved back to the playpen, lifting Sophia again. And the toddler grabbed her mother's face with sticky hands. She'd been eating the organic crackers Elena paid too much for, but her smile was pure joy, untainted by any knowledge of corporate revenge or destroyed dynasties. Daniel's father said something else, Elena admitted, But she was talking to Sophia now, not Margaret. He said the best revenge against people who treated you as powerless is becoming someone who uses power to protect others instead of dominate them, because that proves they were wrong about who you were. But it also proves you're better than who they tried to make you become. Are you? Margaret asked quietly. But the question wasn't challenging. It was genuinely curious. Better than they tried to make you? Elena considered that for a long moment, but Sophia squirmed to be put down, wanting to return to her blocks. I'm working on it, she finally said, setting her daughter down carefully. The Thompson Corporation employs 340 people now, up from 218 months ago. We've implemented profit sharing, paid parental leave, and mental health benefits that most manufacturing companies consider too expensive. But our retention rate is 94% and productivity is up 60%. She returned to her desk, but her quarterly reports suddenly felt less important than they had an hour ago. I'm not healing the world, Margaret. I'm not even healing myself completely, but I'm trying to make sure that the power I took from people who abused it gets used differently than they would have used it, and maybe that's enough. It's more than enough, Margaret said, but she was already heading for the door, legal folders in hand. I'll tell Daniel his request is denied. Don and I'll draft a cease and desist for Victoria's interview attempts, and I'll schedule the European expansion meeting for next month, because whether you're fully healed or not, you're still the best CEO I've ever represented. But you're also a mother who brings her daughter to work and cries in her office when someone reminds her that revenge isn't the same as recovery. She paused in the doorway, but her smile was genuine. For what it's worth, Elena, that night at the promotion party, I thought I was watching a brilliant strategic mind execute a perfect plan. But today I realize I was watching a traumatized woman try to protect herself the only way she knew how. Both things can be true, but the second one makes you human instead of mythical. Harry and Sophia needs a human mother more than the world needs another untouchable billionaire. The door closed, but Elena remained at her desk, watching Sophia play with blocks she'd stack and destroy and stack again with toddler determination. The baby had no idea her mother had destroyed her father's family in a single night. But someday she'd ask questions that deserved honest answers. Not sanitized versions, but the complete truth about power, revenge, survival, and the complicated space between justice and cruelty where most human decisions actually lived. Elena's phone buzzed with a text from Daniel's father. Coffee again next month? I'd like to meet my granddaughter, but only if you're comfortable. No pressure, no expectations. Am I just an old man who made mistakes trying to do better before it's too late? She stared at that message for a long time, but Sophia's laughter, pure and uncomplicated, finally made the decision. Yes, she typed back, but she added conditions. Supervised visits, public locations, and if you ever hurt her the way your family hurt me, you'll discover that building an empire was just practice for what I'm capable of when someone threatens my daughter. His response came immediately. Fair enough. That's exactly the kind of mother she needs. Powerful enough to protect her, but wise enough to know the difference between protection and isolation. See you next month. Elena set the phone down, but she moved to the window, looking out over the city where the Thompson name still meant something. Just not what it used to mean. And the company had survived its reformation, but she was still surviving hers. And maybe that was the real lesson the promotion party night had taught her. Destruction was easy when you had unlimited resources, but rebuilding, whether a company or yourself, required something harder than money or strategy. It required admitting that winning didn't fix broken things, it just revealed them more clearly. Mama, Sophia called from the playpen, but she was holding up a block like it was the greatest achievement in human history. Elena turned from the window and knelt beside her daughter, accepting the block with appropriate reverence. Because this, not the quarterly reports or the European expansion or the systematic destruction of people who'd hurt her, was the real work. Teaching Sophia that power was a tool, not an identity. Showing her that strength meant protecting people weaker than yourself, not dominating them. Proving every single day that the woman who'd walked 5 miles in unbearable heat had survived to become someone better than the people who'd forced her to take that walk. The promotion party had ended a dynasty 18 months ago, but sitting on her office floor building block towers with her daughter, Elena finally understood what Daniel's father had tried to tell her. She hadn't won that night by destroying the Thompsons. She'd won every morning since by choosing to be the kind of person who used power for something other than revenge. Imperfectly, inconsistently, but genuinely trying. And in the end, that trying was the only thing that mattered, because Sophia would remember these moments, building blocks, laughing together, it being present, long after she forgot the quarterly earnings or the corporate victories. The real legacy wasn't the empire Elena had built or the dynasty she destroyed, but the daughter she was raising to understand that strength without compassion was just cruelty with better funding, and that the hardest victory was choosing kindness when revenge would be easier. Again, Sophia demanded, knocking down the tower they'd built, but Elena smiled and started rebuilding, because that was what you did when things fell apart. You built them back better, you learned from the collapse, and you kept trying until the structure could finally hold the weight of everything you'd survived to create it. Outside the window, the city moved forward, indifferent to corporate drama or personal redemption. But inside this office, a mother and daughter were building something more important than empires. They were building a future where power meant protection instead of domination, and where the lessons of cruelty taught by one generation could be transformed into lessons of resilience for the next. It wasn't the ending Elena had imagined when she'd walked through those executive doors 18 months ago, but it was better, messier, more complicated, more human, and ultimately more true to the person she was becoming rather than the person she'd had to be to survive. The blocks fell. They rebuilt them. And in that simple act lived all the hope that revenge alone could never provide. Dear viewers, the greatest victory isn't destroying those who hurt you. It's becoming someone whose power protects others instead of dominating them. Odd revenge may satisfy temporarily, but the hard work of healing, rebuilding, and choosing compassion despite having every reason for cruelty is what transforms survival into true triumph. Sophia will inherit not just her mother's wealth, but her mother's hard-won understanding that strength means building up rather than tearing down, and that legacy will outlast any corporate empire.